And we're seeing that heavily in this popularization model as well. So do I think that for good engagement we need the rock stars? No. I think that for good engagement we need to make sure that we actually incorporate public opinion in many diverse ways into scientific practice. But it certainly helps to have a popularized science as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question, thank you for that, is to Diane from Samantha. How important is publishing in the endeavor of science?
Well, I'm a librarian. Does I get a joke, get a laugh again? How important is publishing? I think the importance of the scholarly record is of utmost significance. Having that record, I do believe that science is built on science, and so all of that is very important. But when we talk about the commercial models of publishing and the politics that go behind that, that's a different question. So the question again is, how important is publishing in
the endeavor of
in the endeavor of science? I think it's crucial. Does that mean that as a scientist, the only thing you have to worry about is your publishing record? No, I don't believe that that is true. But again, that's something that maybe some other people can comment on as well.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Publishing? Publish or perish? Yes, no, maybe? We all just have to publish.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, you have to have the record. I mean,
Absolutely.
we all build on that. So the publishing is important, but how you publish, who makes money off publishing, what are the, who has the power in publishing, who controls what gets published and what doesn't get published, those are all the difficult questions.
Interestingly, also with this idea of publishing, is there's now a wider public audience when it comes to scientific production. Some of you are familiar with informal science, and there are markers where people in the public are making scientific claims, especially in the synthetic biology community. I talked about synthetic biology very briefly. There's a whole movement called DIY Bio, do-it-yourself synthetic biology, where you, as an amateur scientist in your home, can actually do things like gene sequencing, and for a few $100s buying things on the internet off Amazon, you can, at your home, have your own home laboratory and be making scientific discoveries. Whether others can then access this information is then the issue. And so there's new open forums, as we've talked about, where we're able to actually share scientific findings that are not through the direct routes of the publishing models. And these little niche communities are sprouting up in different arenas, and the synthetic biology group is one of the founders, and they themselves have their own codes of ethics, and they're trying to get at their own codes of regulation, because there becomes new ethical issues and considerations about biosafety and biosecurity with these types of measures, because now what you're doing is you're actually creating new synthetic organisms in your home rather than in a secured laboratory. And so there's a whole new conundrum of issues that pop up with these types of new scientific productions, but we know that we also now have this new opportunity to continue scientific endeavors outside of the laboratory, which means outside of the typical publishing model as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, next question is for Kien Woon. Does scientism imply that science is not necessarily the best way of acquiring knowledge?
Okay, so my answer to that is that in the first place, should there only be one way? And should there only be one best way? And can human life, natural phenomena, complexity be understood from any single way which is promoted as the best way? So I think we have to allow ourselves for different kinds of processes to get to the truth. And the truth may not just be a matter of facts. Yeah? There's a very interesting question about the relationship between science and religion. If we follow the scientism model, there is no place for religion in human life. But that goes against what we know about millions and millions of human beings through time who have had religious experiences and are still having. And the question is, even in religion itself, there could be a need for scientific questioning. the truth that is revealed by some holy text needs to have some kind of interpretation rather than taken as a literal truth, for example. So I think in NTU we say, let's not be trapped in our silo and in our own silos and only have one way. We benefit more from talking to each other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. That leads on to the next question, actually, which is for Teru. Is religion epistemically good or bad? Are science and religion epistemically compatible? Is that like a one lecture course for you or something?
So the question is whether religion is epistemically good or bad? Well, I mean, it depends on your, you know, okay. So that depends, right? Because, I mean, if I'm a religious person, religion is a way to knowledge, right? So, I mean, for that kind of a person, religion is epistemically good. And so, it depends, right, on what you think religion is and ultimately what knowledge really is. And that's a question that, so this might get back to Anthony's, what he was saying, that, I was talking about this idea that philosophers had of coming up with sort of the proper rules of doing science. And that was a huge project that philosophers worked on for centuries, and it really took off in the 20th century. There were a lot of philosophers interested in uncovering the proper rules of science. And that project would allow people to differentiate between science and what a lot of philosophers called metaphysics, which just meant really bad stuff, and maybe a lot of people would include religion among that. And so that a lot of philosophers had this, there was this project of determining the proper rules of science in order so that we would be able to reject things like religion. Okay, but it turns out that there was this whole project, and lots of very, very, very smart people worked on it. But nobody ever came up with sort of the proper rules of science. And in fact, in the 1960s, a person with a very good scientific background, he had a PhD in physics from Harvard, Thomas Kuhn, sort of said, he came to the conclusion that, there is no one proper set of such rules. The rules, there are rules, but they're always relative to sort of the worldview of the person involved. And so, so the idea is that, if you're looking for sort of the one absolute set of sort of epistemically good rules, I think philosophy has tried to come up with that, and they've failed. And so, my opinion is that there really isn't anything like that, and I think we still we have to live with religion, and I don't think we have a good. If you want to argue against religion based on epistemic goodness, that's, I think, going to be a very tough job.
And I think you got the toughest question there. That was from someone called Timmy. Okay, this one is actually, it's a touch by what Dan mentioned, but it's actually aimed at Chris. Is in social media, there are reliable and unreliable news. How do we differentiate between them? As an individual, how would you differentiate between what is reliable, what is unreliable?
Having good consumer media literacy skills is one of the most crucial things that you can learn through secondary education and beyond. And it's a skill that many people do not possess. And we oftentimes have difficulty distinguishing between sources that are reliable and are valid and those that are not. A quick example. A few years ago, I was doing some work in nanotechnology, and there had been an outbreak. It was during the H1N1 season, and I was working in North Carolina at the time, and there was a vaccine that came out, that if you got the vaccine, you'd be much less likely to get H1N1. And a guy by the name of William F. Engdahl came out with a blog post saying, do not get the vaccine because it has nanoparticles in it that can kill you. And people took his blog post as truth, and his blog post was taken up by other media sources and reported elsewhere, including the Wall Street Journal and a few other places on their own websites, where they repurposed the article, repackaged it, and put him on as a guest author. And my dissertation advisor at the time, David Berube, and I wrote to a lot of media companies saying you need to take down and retract this article immediately because it is misleading. And this is just a quick case. And the reason why we had to do that was because this gentleman had done no research, was a conspiracy theorist, and based all of his article findings off of pure opinion and had made up sources. All to try and convince people to stay away from getting this vaccine because of his own opinions, which typically were tied to other things like globalization, rather than even worrying about the actual safety of the vaccine itself. So we have to be very careful with these kinds of media tools, and I think that trying to build that literacy skill to understand what is actually a valid type of article and what is valid news is something that's pressing and concerning, especially with the speed of digital media, where we do see articles and news stories take on a life of their own unvalidly.
Okay, that's a good. I mean, there's been a few cases. I remember someone modified Wikipedia to say who killed John F. Kennedy, and people started quoting it as well. So it does happen. You're right. It's very easy to circulate stories, and you need that kind of ability to take them down, and also retractions. I mean, nowadays in the news, a lot of press are reporting and saying, we apologize for this article, it was misconstrued or misinterpreted. Okay, thank you for that. Moving on to the next one. Let's go for something nice and interesting. Nice and interesting, and which means make you all think very hard. Oh, Diane, this one is something to do with research integrity. Who should be held responsible for data manipulation and falsification in a publication? Is the system itself culpable?
Oh, I love these really easy questions. They're all very easy. Who should be held responsible? I suppose my gut reaction is it's the community of scientists and researchers should be held responsible. So all of the different players and pieces have a role there, have a role. So you as researchers have a role, your labs have a role, your universities have a role, your publishers have a role. So I think that along the way there are many checks and balances that need to be used in order to ensure that. Are we ever going to live in a world where there's never going to be falsification? You know, there never has been. You know, it's there, it's a part of something we have to work with. But it goes back again to a very simple word that most people hate when librarians say, which is literacy. And we're not talking about literacy, can you read? But we're talking about media literacy, data literacy. Every reader is also responsible for what they read and how they interpret it, whether you're reading a piece of, an article on Wikipedia or social media, or whether you're reading a journal article that's going to affect your research. You'd best understand the methodology, the data, has it been handled properly yourself in order to make decisions about how you're going to use that. So maybe that's not a very good answer. But
It's everyone's involved, which is true. It's not just one individual, so I agree with that. Ken Woon.
Yes.
Okay, how would science in synchronization with humanities look? And will there be different for different sciences? So is there a one-fit-all solution to this, or you think it'll be depending on which science you look at?
Okay, so the first thing I would like to say is that you guys have heard of the term interdisciplinarity. Now, any word that has 8 syllables you know. But there is a certain truth to this idea, which you can see around you, that however good we are in each of our own specific disciplinary area, there is no way for us to avoid dialogue with others. The environment is one such example, right? How do we address all these issues, the great global problems of the day and so on? As strong as we are in any one discipline, and we should be, we have to reach out to others. And the world that our graduates will be working in will be a very multidisciplinary world involving interdisciplinary dialogue. I just quickly say that for humanities, somehow this is a kind of self-criticism of our environment. There is very little reading. We do not read as much as we should. True, there's a lot of browsing. There's a lot of Googling. There's a lot of information that it's like a whole supermarket of things that you can pick and choose and mix and match. But serious reading of stories, of ideas, and so on, this is something that will help with the interdisciplinary dialogue. As for the second part of the question about specific disciplines, let me just give one example or two examples. Economics. Economics within the humanities and social sciences, economists always pride themselves as being very scientific. And econometrics is the most quantitative branch of economics. And yet, with all that, very few, if any, economists predicted the 2008 global financial crisis. What does this mean? It means that economics alone has to dialogue with other sciences, including psychology, including behavioral sciences, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the most fascinating areas in contemporary scholarship is in evolutionary biology and issues related to human evolution and so on. This kind of inquiry really requires many disciplines to participate.
Thank you. Teru, another one for you. This is from Siddharth. Is science a mere tool to exploit nature and pamper humans?
Okay. Is science a mere tool to exploit nature and pamper humans? I mean, okay, well, I mean, so it's a question, right, of what you take to be valuable, right? And if you think that, now the question says mere device tool to exploit nature and pamper humans. I'm not quite sure what's being meant there. I mean, you might think that, okay, well, sort of the ultimate value is sort of human flourishing, okay? And there's nothing more that there's nothing higher than that we would want. And if that's what we want, okay, then yeah, I mean, if that's our goal, then science should, you know, I don't see why we shouldn't view science as sort of a means to achieve that goal. Now, if there's the way the question is phrased, exploit nature and pamper humans, maybe the person is asking, isn't there this sort of bias towards humans, and maybe we should respect nature more? And if that's the question, then yeah, I mean that's another question of, okay, what do you think that is the most valuable thing? Now some people might think it's human flourishing is the most important, but others could think that yeah, it's nature, and humans as a part of nature, and it's not just human flourishing, it's all of nature. And so if you think that, well, that's sort of a different worldview, and it would be hard to sort of, again, sort of say, to sort of use, say, say that one worldview is better, sort of epistemically better than the other. I would just say that, okay, well, it's a value question. Okay, what do we want? Okay, and well, that's a that's a philosophical question, and it's worth thinking deeply about. But I don't have the answer of which we should value more.
I told you, get all the hardest questions. Everyone else gets the easy ones. What do you think of social media? Duh. You get the one is, what is the meaning of life? Okay, these questions now are more general, so anyone can answer. According to you, whichever one wants to answer, what is the biggest problem modern science faces, and how can this be overcome? Ooh.
I think that currently in science, we're at a point where we understand that the more we know, the more questions we have. And I think that the next big step, and I think it might be a great topic for the next year's presentation, would be the topic of uncertainty. I think that uncertainty permeates just about everything that we touch on with our understanding of science and our application of science. And that uncertainty seems to be the biggest elephant in the room that touches on all aspects of our work, be it in scientific production or consumption. And so I think that just that idea of uncertainty and its many manifestations is something that we as scientists and conscientious members of society really need to look at. How can we better the situation and reduce some of the uncertainties, because we have them running rampant through all of our work and creating havoc.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? Yes? Can you
Well, you know, in NTU, there is a growing field of inquiry called complexity studies. Right? So uncertainty, complexity, I think these are fascinating areas. We also have a graduate school that is called the Interdisciplinary Graduate School, the IGS. So I think NTU is on a good track in relation to these questions. Yeah.
Okay, this one is.
I would add too.
You want to go? Sorry, go for it. Sorry.
I was going to say something about complexity as well, and I think again that one of the things that I think we have to have a better understanding of, or more realistic understanding of. I mean, we've got this. There's that ideal science, and it shouldn't be touched by, pressures of economics and industry and publishing, but that's just not the world we live in, and they do all work together and they do all support each other. So getting that complex picture of how all these things interact together is something that I think will bring science forward.
Okay. You want to rest in this question? You want to relax, okay, fine. This question is from Ken. This one is probably more suitable for all of you, a bit more light-hearted. What do you feel about Stephen Hawking's coming out with his own movie? I guess this is probably something which, Chris, you may want to say something about it because it is promotion of science.
I'm for it. I think that, again, to go back to that popularization model, Stephen Hawking is, of course, one of the science rock stars, right? And any time that they have something that can create some buzz that's promotional, it causes hype, but we know that can turn into good things that engage broader audiences. Again, the question then becomes, who's actually watching it? And if it's actually promoting anything new to anybody that's new or not.
Okay.
I'll just quickly say, because there are so many students here, because your topic is science communication, I think in NTU, we really have to pay attention to the art of communication and the art of communicating scientific ideas, not just through journal papers and so on, but in everyday life. Because when our graduates go out there, not just undergraduates, but also our graduate students beginning new jobs in other universities, communicating ideas has to be a basic skill that we have more or less been trained and mastered in before we go start our work out there. So Stephen Hawking is a great example.
Okay, so, when's the film coming out? Ken, when's the film coming out? You're useless. You ask a question, you haven't got all the information beforehand. Come on. Good answer. Okay, I found one interesting one. I'm just trying to find it again now, sorry. Oh, this is everybody. This is from Siram. War has always led to breakthrough in technology in the hopes of winning the war. Necessity is the mother of invention. Does war provide this necessity? I already declared I wanted to drop the atomic bomb, so I've already committed myself. So, it's everyone. So you want to go for it? Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know. I think, to me, this is just, again, like a no-brainer. I mean, I just think that, well, personally, again, there are people who think that there's sort of an intrinsic value to knowledge. And maybe you're one of these people. But my own opinion is that, okay, well, no, it's really about what you can do with it. And if that's the case, then it's sort of, I think that it's sort of self-defeating if if you have to have this horrible tragedy where, thousands or millions of people die, and in order to, well, get people to produce new knowledge, well, that's sort of self-defeating. I just don't think, I mean, this is a no-brainer for me. So that
Chris?
I think it becomes a question of motivation. When you look at something as fueling as a war on people's desire to actually do something, right? And when it's war, it's literally to survive, right? And if we take this as a communication idea, as a metaphor for some kind of motivation, and we turn it into a war on something else, like a war on climate change, we see a new motivation where we're still trying to survive and be able to produce new knowledge out of it. So I think that maybe the lesson here is to look at what is the intention and desire and push, what's the motivation that's driving us towards these types of knowledge domains, and how can we actually improve those motivations for us to learn.
Kim?
Yes, well, I raised this question of the atomic bomb, which in some interpretation ended the Second World War. In some other interpretation, the war would have ended without the dropping of the bomb. Now, we don't have to look into these questions in detail, but certainly the rise of modern science, if you follow the trajectory, the Renaissance, the European Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, modern science and the industrialization go hand in hand. And modern warfare, the industrialization of the means to inflict mass violence. And there are all these theories about what's called the military industrial complex and so on. Now, these are very difficult questions. There may be any one of us, at least I know one of us sitting near me, who may feel that the decision to drop the atomic bomb was correct. And maybe behind that was an earlier act of violence, Pearl Harbor. The technology that was used in Pearl Harbor, essentially planes and very simple technology, human beings willing to kill themselves. The human body as a weapon, right? So, and the technology of the atomic bomb, they are two different scales, but we are talking about technology, and we are talking about science. And of course, the whole question of war today, in the Middle East, everywhere, and the use of weaponry, including drones and so on. If war involves the kind of technology, which is essentially like computer games, you don't really need boots on the ground. The idea of killing people does not involve aiming a rifle at somebody and killing that person. It takes the whole question of the human dimensions of war and violence to a whole new level. So yes.
Okay.
And by the way, 911 was also fairly primitive technology.
Yes.
The human body, a box cutter, hijacking a plane.
Yeah. Okay, this one a bit more light-hearted. I'm going to try and say it in Chinese, but I'm going to get it wrong. Zhongguoren Tabu Gao Sing. The question is to Chris, why are the stats on the basic 3 questions rate so low in China? So some Chinese are very upset. Why are they bottom of your list? And I was surprised that the Americans were smarter than the Europeans.
Science questions so low for China.
First of all, I didn't make up those numbers. Right? I truthfully don't know. I know this is from a very large world report. If you email me, I'll be happy to share you a link to the actual report. I have it sitting on my desktop in my office. And there are hundreds and hundreds of pages expounding on the data collection methods of these types of worldwide reports. And then from there, you have the knowledge, you have the understanding of what the metric is, and you, as a researcher, have to figure out what does this number actually mean. And that could be a whole number of things. There may have been translational issues. I don't know. I haven't looked in depth at the study. And so I think that your task can be to figure out why is that number so low, and is there something I can do to help improve that, especially if you plan to go back to China and do work in these types of things as educators. I do know that there is some speculation worldwide that there are, in certain areas of the world, greater push for science literacy in early education. And this becomes a marker for greater success in science in adults. And so one of the other models of trying to improve science literacy is to first teach people, of course, while they're young, but then sustain that over time. Because we've seen in many places, once high school's over, right, you're done with your typical education, people who don't like science stay away from science forever after that, right? Whew, I'm done with that last science class. I'm done with science, right? And so we're trying to push now towards trying to have more lifelong attachment with scientific learning. And I think that that will help improve rates of these types of numbers around the world that seem rather low. You know, at best, it was a coin flip for right or wrong on a true-false question. And we should be able to do better, right? And that's going to take lifelong learning and education. And the question again becomes, how do we actually facilitate that?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to add on too much. I'm just picking up on something which I forgot to say, because Christopher said something about maybe we can be more positive and translate the idea of war into something like war on climate change or war on this or war on that. Now, this is a really good example of the interaction between science and the humanities. Recently on BBC, I heard a program. You know that for many, many years, there was a campaign called War on Cancer, right? But this metaphor of a war on the part of cancer patients having something in their body which is part of their body. So that metaphor now is seen by many to be not very useful because you are living with that enemy in your own body. And people are wondering whether there should be different kinds of communication about this. And this is yet another example to show that medicine as a science, which is perhaps one of the highest sciences and one of the most practical sciences, cannot do without literature, without philosophy, without sociology, without all the other humanities and social sciences.
Thank you for that. One last question, which I guess goes back to Chris. This one, it's a light-hearted one as well. Does the function of risk have a specific math form? Because you had a nice equation about risk equals function of PNM.
That original algorithm, that risk is a function of magnitude times probability, that is the form that they are using mathematically when they're actually calculating the likelihood of risk events. So that's the exact algorithm that they're using to predict how often planes crash. That's the exact algorithm that toxicologists use to predict what are the likelihoods that these lab workers could potentially get lung cancer. And so you're actually looking at a magnitude degree, right? This is the degree of harm. So if we were to take it into medical terms and consider it a pill. So everyone's going to take a pill in this room. And the magnitude would be, what is the degree of poison in that pill? How damaging is that poison in the pill? And the probability would be, what's the likelihood that you're actually going to get sick from that poison? And so this is the dominant used algorithm. There's been a lot of talk in the toxicological community in the last 5 years or so about how do we actually deal with issues of complexity, deal with issues of uncertainty, looking at these types of algorithms where we know that we have a lot of holes in the data. And so how do we accurately try and assess risk when we have high levels of uncertainty? So they're moving towards things like fuzzy set logic, and there are other mathematical forms that are being used to try and assess risk more accurately, given the high complexity and high uncertainty that we have.
Okay, thank you for that. That was the last question. So would you all please give a round of applause to the speakers again? Okay, back. I guess it's back to the MC again.
Thank you very much, Professor. And this brings us to the end of today's event. And on behalf of the organizing
I'm
committee,
very proud of the
we'd
student.
like to thank Professor John Chang, NTU Student Life Office, NTU Student Affairs Office, and the NTU Graduate Student Council for their generosity and support.